Good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to this webinar. It is absolutely wonderful to have you. I'm your host, Francois Creel. I am the Client Success Principal at Cyberlogic. And before I go over to the next slide with a further introduction, I'm encouraging you to just participate in our poll. I see we have 4 responses so far. So as you enter the session and settle in, please, if you can, participate. We will be referring to some of the insights a little bit later in our session. Before I introduce Vilmarie to you, just a little bit about me. I'm a management consultant by profession and have found my way into technology and an outsourced CIO type focus area over time. I really enjoy my purpose in helping empower those to lead change in the technology space and have been working closely with ENS over the years. So this is not our first webinar together. It's always a privilege to be joining forces like this and helping clients with a holistic approach to any compliance goal or outcome that you wish to achieve. I'm going to go to the next slide. So long, but if you still want to participate in the poll, I'll put the link in the chat for you. So we'll just hand over to Vilmarie quickly to introduce herself as well. And some of my other colleagues and our other panelists will be introducing themselves as they come online later in the session. Good morning, Vilmarie.
Good morning, Francois, and morning, everyone. I'm Vilmarie Strachen. I'm an executive in ENS's Technology, Media, and Telecommunications Division. What that means is we're a bunch of corporate lawyers that specialize in all things tech law, which is quite wide. So from your traditional technologies to emerging technologies like AI, and what we basically do is we help customers or our clients like you guys with, on the regulatory side, complying with regulatory issues that touch on IT, like the joint standards, like the prudent authority directives, like data privacy laws. On a commercial side, it means that we assist with drafting and negotiating agreements around your IT suppliers and vendors and outsourcing. So quite a wide area, but we specialize in IT law, and that is why the joint standards fall kind of within our area of expertise, and why we hope that in the next few days we can unpack this joint standard with you and make it a little bit more palatable, to break down into bite-sized pieces that you can, and give you some tools to help you implement this in your organization. Francois and his team from Cyberlogic Hyperclear. Thank you very much, Francois, for joining us again. Like Francois said, we have done quite a few webinars with him in the past. So some of you might recall we did quite a few data privacy webinars together. So Francois and team, thank you very much for agreeing to do this project with us. I know we've had many sessions, lots of brainstorms going on to get this all together, but it's been great collaborating with you guys and working together again on this project. Thanks, Francois.
Thank you so much, Vilmarie. Really appreciate the journey and looking forward to the next couple of days with you and also all of our valued guests here. Thank you for trusting us, first and foremost, everybody in the room. We know that you have put time aside in your busy schedule and your day. So what we wanted to do in the design of this webinar is not to do one day, but to break it up over a few days. And we trust that's going to support you and your schedule so you can still get to your day-to-day to-do list and priorities, but also reflect in between the days and the sessions, and maybe you have questions that pop up for you as you navigate the journey with us. On the screen, you should see an agenda outlining all 3 days and the focus areas. And as you can see, and as many of you would know by now, the legal and practical IT components overlap and intertwine quite a bit. And we hope that we will give you the best holistic view of how to approach this compliance effort. I would be so bold to say that I don't know of any partnership like this at the moment, approaching the legal requirement all the way through into the practicals of IT. And we certainly hope that whatever goals or objectives you're bringing to the session, that will be ticked off as we go along. So today we will be focusing a lot of our time on IT strategy, IT risk management, and IT operations. The second and third day we'll be going into the other topics on the screen, and on day 3 my colleagues Genevieve and Roscoe will predominantly be facilitating that session, as we will be focusing a lot on security and other elements in which they are the subject matter experts. So let's jump in and get going into a quick recap. Now, we want to keep this short. Potentially some of you have attended a webinar that we hosted late last year, and we thought let's just set the scene on where we are, how this came to be, why are we here, and let's just put a little bit of a foundation in place. So Vilmarie, can you help us just understand what brought us here and how this compliance requirement came to be? Thank you so much.
So I think we're all aware of the joint standards that were issued, started in 2023. So the first joint standard, and we did a webinar on this last year, and you should have all received a copy of that webinar when you registered. But if not, don't worry, you will catch up soon enough as we go through today. So the Joint Standard 1 came into effect 15 November 2024. And that is basically giving guidelines and, well, not really guidelines, it's more like a directive on what is expected by the authority for financial institutions to have in place when it comes to governing your IT and managing IT assets. The Joint Standard 2 of 2024 deals with cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So it's taking it one step further, and it's saying, what is the expectations and requirements that must be in place for financial institutions to deal with their cybersecurity and cyber resilience. The Joint Standard 2 is coming into effect in June this year. Both of these standards apply to all financial institutions, and I'll take you just through a recap of what is all included in financial institutions. You'll see that Joint Standard 2, the cybersecurity, has quite a wide and wider reach than the Joint Standard 1 of 2023. Both of these joint standards place quite a bit of responsibility on the board or senior management to ensure compliance. And as we go through the slides, you will see that a lot of the documents and frameworks and policies that are required to be put in place has to be approved by your board. And in instances, even state very clearly that your board remain liable for the implementation and compliance of these policies and procedures. Then just to remind you, everyone, or those that don't know, there's sometimes a bit of confusion with a second Joint Standard 1 of 2024 that was issued that applies to outsourcing by insurers. So it's different to Joint Standard 1 of 2023. The Joint Standard 1 of 2024 for insurers deals specifically with where insurers outsource certain of their IT functionality. Now, there's a similar directive that were issued by the Prudent Authority for banks, quite a few years back. So this one is just specific for insurers. I'm mentioning it here just to avoid confusion between the various joint standards. The joint standard of 2024 we'll touch on further down when we deal with outsourcing of IT assets, but this is not the main focus of this webinar. So if we then look at what is considered financial institutions, under Joint Standard 1, financial institutions includes any bank, a branch, or a bank controlling company. It's a mutual bank, it is an insurer and a controlling company, a manager as defined in the Collective Investment Schemes Control Act, a market infrastructure as defined in the Financial Markets Act, and then a discretionary or an administrative FSP. If you look at the definition of financial institutions under Joint Standard 2, you'll see that it is a bit wider. So I've only marked in blue those that are new. So what is not already covered in Joint Standard 1. So it's all of the same entities that were covered in Joint Standard 1, but then also a Category 1 FSP that provides investment fund administrative services. Pension funds and pension fund administrators are also included. OTC derivative providers, defined in the Financial Markets Act regulations. And then, interesting enough, a registered credit rating agency are also included in Joint Standard 2. So what this means is when we talk about all the security requirements that are set out in Joint Standard 2, it has a wider application than Joint Standard 1. It will also apply to the new categories that were added in the definition that we've marked here in blue. So if we look at practical compliance, so what does it mean? The joint standards are quite prescriptive on what documents, policies, standards, and procedures must be in place for all financial institutions. And it requires that these policies and procedures should be documented. So while you may have policies and procedures in place, they may not always be documented. There is now quite a bit of guidance on what must be documented. And not only does it say you must have certain policies or frameworks in place, it also gives a whole list of what must be in those documents, what must be covered, what must be regulated. And we'll go obviously through that in the next few days with you. So while your organization may have tons of existing policies and procedures because of existing legislation, whether that is the existing directives, whether it is to comply with POPI or Cybercrimes Act, the new joint standards are adding new requirements and principles. So it may be that your organization either needs to put in place these policies or frameworks where it isn't in place already, or that you need to conduct a gap analysis to see how does our existing policies compare to the requirements of the joint standards, and do we need to do anything to update our existing policies and procedures in order to become compliant with the joint standards. It seems like there's a lot to be done, a lot of change. Francois, you are a change champion. How do we deal with all of this new overload of information and change that's coming?
Thanks so much, Wilmarie. Yes, I think in the previous webinar we had the same quote on the screen, and I thought it was good just to include as part of our recap today that management is about coping with complexity, but leadership, by contrast, is about coping with change. And I want to invite all of you to look at this as a change opportunity. This sector has gone through tremendous change over the last couple of years, and perhaps you're showing up today in the space of, wow, more change. But I'd like to just help you see this as an opportunity as we go into the practicalities. I think the question always, Vilmi, that comes up, what's the minimum that I must do to comply? And we really want you to see this as an opportunity to improve your organization in so many different ways, whether that is serving the stakeholder, the customer better with your purpose and your just cause, or to become more resilient and operationally more efficient and secure. There's so many things that we can look at as opportunities here. And I certainly hope everybody, as you navigate this journey with us today, that you will also look at this in the same light. So the next slide, I ask you the question, are you reacting to change or are you leading it? And I'm hoping that with all of you here, you are change leaders by being proactive and you embracing your role in change, and also seeing how we can take our organizations forward, not just to be minimum on compliance, but competitive and potentially differentiated in the market. So with that in mind, I want to quickly share the results of the poll. Just let me know if you can share. I'm just going to drag a window across with the results. Let me know if you can see it. Anything on screen at this point, Vilbury and the team?
No.
Okay, that's fine. What I'll do is I'll just include that in one of the slides a little bit later. But it was interesting that I'm seeing thus far, and I'm seeing more results coming in, thank you, is there's a clear split so far between attendees looking for clarity on the compliance side, but also on the IT practicalities. It seems to be almost in the middle. So I'll share more as we go from here and a little bit later in the session. So please do continue to give us those insights in the poll. We've got 8 or 9 results. So if we go into this first section, we have a unique approach to share with you. The main question, of course, how to comply. And we have these 9 requirements in front. So, Vilmarie, if we look at all these bubbles, where did they come from? What language did we use here on the screen, and just what motivated us to group things in this way?
Francois, we looked at the headings or the categories in Joint Standard 1 specifically. So today we're dealing with Joint Standard 1. So these bubbles represent headings in Joint Standard 1. And why we dealt with it like this is because we're trying to link the Joint Standard to practical implementation. So when you look at IT strategy, you will find that as a heading in your Joint Standard. And so when you get stuck with any of the topics discussed in the Joint Standard, then hopefully you can jump back to these slides, which you all will get, and you can go to IT operations or IT assurance. So these are headings as it is in the Joint Standard, and we're going to take each one of them over the 3 days, break them down, and then deal with them. You'll see on the side, we talk about cybersecurity. That is our Joint Standard 2, which kind of overarch all of this, because I don't think we can look at IT strategy, risk management, sensitive data, any of these things on the screen without considering the security aspects. We're not going to focus too much on security today because we have a whole day dedicated to security, but it's there as a reminder that when we look at all of this, that cybersecurity and cyber resilience, which we're dealing with on day 3, is very much an overarching theme of all of these categories of risk we're looking at too.
Thank you for helping us set the foundation for how the webinar is structured, Vilmarie. And if we go into the next slide, we have our unique, I suppose, signature view on this compliance effort. We've got 4 chevrons on the screen: legal, people, process, and technology. And ladies and gentlemen, what I'd like you to see moving forward, we'll have tables on the screen that outlines each of these components as it applies to the compliance effort. But we really want to take everything through these four key elements of an organization. In particular, one thing I want to highlight is process is what brings people and technology together. And that's often something we miss in these conversations. So we hope that putting our recommendations forward in this view will certainly help you and other stakeholders in your organization to contribute towards the compliance effort. Vilma, is there anything you'd like to add before we move on to the narrative for the webinar?
No, Francois, I think you've covered it well. I think legal people process, or like we've been terming it over the past few months as our LPPT process, will become more clear when we give you examples. So we're just planting the seed now, but as we go through the table and we start showing you how we implement each of those little bubbles into this, what we call the LPPT process, it will make a lot more sense. Hopefully.
And we welcome your feedback in the chat as we go. So at this point, I want to mention that we welcome your questions or thoughts in the Q&A section of the webinar. We'll keep monitoring it and we will take a moment to respond. We can respond in the chat as well. So please do share your thoughts and we'll keep monitoring it as we go from here. We'll also take your feedback into account as we go into day 2 and day 3. We wanted to make this memorable and easy to navigate because it is a lot. I'm not going to lie. There is so much information to share with you. And we looked at this narrative of building a house or doing a home renovation. And at this point, I want to invite my colleague Roscoe to introduce himself and say hello, but also share a little bit about why we chose this narrative for today. So Roscoe, when you're ready, please share with us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Francois. Just to introduce myself, I'm Roscoe Peterson. I'm the head of cybersecurity at CyberLogic. I come from my educational background is information systems. I have a postgraduate degree in information systems, and from there, I went straight into cybersecurity. I started off as what you call a white hat hacker or ethical hacker. So that's the people that are doing attack simulations for clients so that they can understand what their actual risk looks like from a cybersecurity perspective. Through that journey, I ended up where I am today as the head of cybersecurity, leading a full department which deals with all aspects of cybersecurity to help protect and add value to our clients. So through this journey, one thing that always stands out to me is, understanding IT concepts and even cybersecurity concepts can be quite challenging for people that are not involved in the industry directly or do not consult in the industry. We like to throw jargon and acronyms, which are quite difficult to understand. So one thing we like to do is to tie it back to something that you do understand, which is something like protecting your home. I can imagine that everyone over here is privileged enough to have a roof over their head. And we all want to protect what is inside our home and protect our home itself. So what we will be doing throughout this webinar is tying all of these concepts back to something that is relatable and something that you can understand, which is very close to what we are speaking about. So for example, if you're speaking about a certain cybersecurity control, we might tie it back to burglar bars so that you can really paint a picture of what these complex IT controls mean and what it means for you and your business, just so that it does resonate a lot better and that it demystifies all of the crazy jargon that is within IT. Thank you, Francois.
So we'll be referring back to the house and how each of the compliance requirements can be related to components of a house's security, the plan, the architectural design, all of that. So we look forward to hearing your feedback as well on how you are receiving this, and we'll make mention as we go. For those of you who are here with us for the 3 days, just bear in mind that if you do attend all 3 days, you are eligible for a prize, and we'll be sharing more detail on what that looks like tomorrow. We certainly hope it will be a meaningful support towards the compliance effort overall. So just keep that in mind. Please do stay all 3 days. We don't necessarily want you to pick and choose topics because they do intertwine a lot and overlap. So thank you just for giving us your full attendance in that regard. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share with you a table that will outline a focus area on IT strategy. But before we do that, it's well worth looking at how IT strategy is defined within this compliance framework. So if I go to the next slide, you should see a definition type slide on there. Vilmarie, is very interesting for me as we go through the overall interpretation and definition, just how much practical application there is. And I also note there's a phrase or 2 words that says clearly defined roles and responsibilities. It's amazing to see how legislation is making its way just into more and more practical dimensions of IT. What are you seeing from a technology law perspective before we go on?
I think the joint standards are definitely one of the more prescriptive pieces of call it legislation that we've seen. I mean, if we look at POPI, data privacy, which we all thought was quite prescriptive, and it really isn't. You know, if we look at the security measures in POPI, it just says you have to have reasonable organizational security measures, but it doesn't really say what does that mean. Or it would say you need to have policies and procedures in place, but there are very little prescription in something like POPI as to what policies and procedures you actually is a must, like this policy must be in place. And in the joint standards, we actually see that they list certain procedures, frameworks that must be in place. The framework must be documented, must be approved by your board. It must be annually, sometimes quarterly reviewed. These are the list of things that must go into that policy. So definitely one of the more prescriptive in terms of IT governance documents that I've seen.
It's a great comparison that you make with POPI in that, I mean, I was on that journey with you back in the day, and there were a lot of questions in terms of what does this mean practically? What must we do? Yeah. What must we have in place? And this is certainly far clearer if I had to draw a comparison from a non-legal, a non-lawyer's perspective. So I think that's really great to highlight. And I mean, I really like the clarity here that you work with as we go into the next part of the webinar. So if you think of IT strategy, ladies and gentlemen, it could be well equated to a blueprint or an architectural design of a house. And typically what you want to do is if you intend to go up a level or build on, you need to have a strong enough foundation in place to be able to do that. And that's how we will approach the IT strategy topic. Many of you work for large organizations that have been around for many, many years, and you're thinking to yourself that I don't have the luxury of rebuilding my house. Well, we'll look at it from home renovation perspective as well. So fear not if you're working for one of the big organizations in the room. We would like you to look at this also as well. What can we change? Do we need to do a little bit of a home edit, so to speak, on the IT strategy? if we go to the next slide, you'll see the LPPT approach applied practically. Now, don't get overwhelmed. You will get the slides and all the bullet points. We are going to be focusing on a couple of points, especially as it pertains to the IT strategy realm. So this is the first time you'll be seeing this table, but it will repeat itself quite a bit. I'm going to mention the to-do list in yellow on the side. You'll see there are tracker notes. If you can see my mouse, there's training tracker, then there's compliance tracker. So as you go, you could add items to your tracker or those tracker topics of things to do. So you'll keep seeing that pop up as we go along. You'll see technology, process, and people. We have what we are putting forward considerations of each dimension, and then people would be all the applicable stakeholders in the organization that you'll need to keep in mind for this particular component. At this point, I think, Wilmarie, we always start with a legal foundation, left to right. So when we look at the multiple bullet points, it's not just Joint Standard 1 of 2023, there are other overlapping pieces of legislation here, like the Companies Act, for example. So can you please elaborate a little bit about what that list means and the overlapping pieces there?
Yeah, sure. So when we put together the LPPT approach, we thought it would be useful to look at what is the existing legislation that financial institutions have to comply with, because it seems like there's bits and pieces of compliance all over the place. So what we try to do is consolidate it all into one approach or one document. Because if you're a bank, there's also some of the SAR Prudent Authority directives. Financial regulatory authority have its own directive. So there's pieces of legislation all over. There's POPI, there's Cybercrimes Act, there's the Companies Act. So what we're trying to do in this table is look at, we always start at what is the Joint Standard 1. So Joint Standard 1 have certain requirements in terms of IT strategy, but so has certain other pieces of legislation. For instance, the King Code. The King Code deals very specifically with the board's obligations and responsibilities around IT governance. So this is not something new. It is an obligation that has been on organizations. And that, like we said earlier on, there's now just a lot more clarity. I would just like to mention as well, as lawyers do, we love disclaimers, that while we have put together this approach for you and we've taken each of the little bubbles in the joint standard and we've put it into a table like this where we break it down into the various things and given you a to-do list. This is very much organization specific. In otherwise, it's not a one size fit all go plug into my organization. Hopefully it is a very good ground or a basis for you to use, but it will have to be adapted depending on your organization. You may be a bank, you may be an insurance company, you may be an administrator. We are dealing with such a large variety of financial institutions that it unfortunately can't just be a plug and play. What will not change is the law, and what will not change is the column that says process, because process we've taken from the joint standard. So in process, it's what you must have in place in terms of the joint standard. What may change is the people in your organization that is involved, because you may have different roles than what we have listed. What may also change, or what will definitely change, is your technology column. The technology tools you use and the technology assets you have will differ from organization to organization. The to-do list we created is based on the process, but it again may differ depending on your organization, what is already in place, what isn't in place. So we are trying to give you a guideline and a document that you can take from here and go populate with your organization or with us to suit you or to adapt it so that it becomes in itself a compliance framework almost that you can complete and adapt to suit your organization. Francois, if I can just continue on the process. If we talk about IT strategy and what is required under the joint standard for IT strategy. So the joint standard says that every financial institution must have an IT strategy. And your IT strategy must be approved by your board, and it must be reviewed annually. And you will see this theme throughout the slides, that there's annual reviews, quarterly reviews. What this means is that this joint standard and the processes and procedures and frameworks that you put in place is not a once-off tick. It is something that are required to be monitored and reviewed continuously. So this process or to-do list or compliance framework will become part of your, or should be part of your continuous compliance and reviews and monitoring and making sure it is stays up to date. The joint standard also require you to have an action plan. So it's saying it doesn't help you have a strategy. It's like, I have this plan for my home renovations, but I've got no plan as to how I'm going to actually implement it. So the standard says you must have an action plan, and this action plan must have measures in place to ensure that you can actually achieve the objectives of your strategy. Your action plan must also be communicated to your people. So whoever you've listed in your people column, whether that is your IT would always be involved in your IT strategy, whether it is whatever roles you have there, your information officer, because I don't think there's any IT strategy that doesn't impact on data and data security, your compliance or regulatory officers, whatever you call that in your organization. And always you will see we have the board and the senior management there, because they have to approve these policies and procedures and strategies, and they have always are ultimately liable. So once you have your IT strategy and your action plan, this must be communicated to your people, and that would be done through training. It also says that your action plan has to be reviewed quarterly. So a lot more than your IT strategy, and it would make sense, right? You have your plan is there, and the plan looks to maybe the next year, but quarterly we're going to review and see how are we progress. Are there any new risks? Are there any new technologies or new threats that we became aware of that we need to maybe adjust our action plan a little bit? Maybe something is not working too well. How do we adapt that? And so these quarterly reviews becomes quite important in making sure that our action plan is on track. And part of that action plan would be a process to monitor the effectiveness of your strategy. And while the standard lists this as something separate, to me, it is part of your quarterly review. If you have your plan and you have quarterly reviews, part of that will be monitoring that process. And then lastly, in terms of IT strategy, it states that you have to notify the authority if your IT strategy deviates or contravenes joint standard 1. And I suppose the simple thing here is just make sure it doesn't. I haven't seen any reason, and maybe there might be some weird or wonderful reason you have, but I can't see in terms of what we've seen in the joint standard that there's any reason that you should have a strategy that contravenes the joint standard. So I think that is a simple, let's just make sure everything is in place and we don't have to notify the authorities. Then, like Francois mentioned, we have a to-do list for you. Again, the to-do list is based, it's trying to assist you with how do we now go and we implement this? What is the things we need to check? Again, this may be adapted to suit your organization. So firstly, we have to have a strategy, IT strategy in place. You might have one in place already. So maybe it's just a process of reviewing it and making sure that it is in line with the requirements. Or it may be that you have to go develop an IT strategy. Either way, whether you are developing or reviewing your IT strategy, you have to ensure that that strategy is approved by your board and that you review it annually. So your first checklist is to ensure that you have this strategy in place and that it is approved. Then ensure that you have your action plan documented and in place, and that is approved. In terms of training tracker, we've said that we have to train our people, our board, and whoever else needs training on our action plan. And then in terms of compliance, we spoke about doing gap analysis. So where you have existing policies and documents, strategies in place, reviewing that to make sure that we can tick all the checkboxes in the joint standard requirements, doing your annual reviews, doing your quarterly reviews, training your staff, and monitoring effectiveness. So you'll see a lot of it repeat in the compliance tracker. It's just to give you hopefully an easier checklist to complete. In terms of your IT strategy, what does that mean? Francois, I know you have some practical examples for us as to how can we, how does it look? How does the IT strategy actually look?
Thank you, Wilmarie. I also wanted to mention thank you at this point for the engagement we're starting to receive. There's actually 1 or 2 questions coming up in the Q&A. There's a very interesting question in the Q&A, Wilmarie, that surfaced around compliance from a group entity perspective or separate entities. So I might encourage you to reply to that as we go into the IT strategy side shortly, Andrea and I. And also thank you, Lisa. I see your comment in the chat as well. Very interesting to share with you. We have from the Cyberlogic side a client who is also a small FSP, and we are the outsourced IT provider. So I would like to encourage you to stay with us, because I will definitely be able to speak to your point that you've raised in the chat as we continue from here. So thank you for that. In the IT strategy topic, ENS asked us, let's put a benchmark forward. And we have, again, very large organizations here, but also potentially smaller organizations. And this benchmark or template that we're going to share with you that will be made available to you is equally applicable to a smaller and a large organization. For the large organization, it might help you go back to basics a little bit. Wilmarie mentioned reviewing the IT strategy. So we hope that if you're a large organization, you will be able to use this as an easy framework to be able to do that review. If you're a smaller organization, this is equally effective because it's a Gartner best practice, which we hold in high regard in the IT space and industry. And it will be as easy for you to complete or to go through if you want to potentially bring your IT strategy up to standard. So we hope it's equally applicable for everybody in the different organizational realms that you find yourself in here today. I'm only going to refer to the Gartner slides briefly because Andrea, who I'll introduce to you shortly, has prepared slides from an ENS and Cyberlogic perspective referencing this framework. So I'm only showing this to you so you know what it is and where to find it. And the strategic plan and template from Gartner looks something like this. Now, as a consultant by training, I like one-pagers, whiteboards, easy to understand and digest sort of frameworks, and this is the one that I chose and planned a bit further with Andrea today to share with you. What I really like about it, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that it focuses so strongly on the business objectives and how to translate a business objective into business capabilities and IT strategic actions. points 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to interrupt myself briefly by saying maybe you're sitting here and you're thinking, I'm not working directly in IT in my organization. Maybe I'm working more in my organization's compliance division, more of a legal role. I'm also sharing this framework with you because it's just as valuable to hold IT stakeholders accountable to reviewing their plan. So I'm hoping it's also going to be valuable for you. It's not meant to be IT speak or IT heavy. It's meant to be business friendly as well. So let me know in the chat or in the Q&A how you are receiving this as we go. I'm highlighting one or two quick elements of the framework, so you'll see it actually helps you self-complete a little bit. The main thing that's coming up for me in the business objective section is consistency. And if you go further, you'll see there's a line on business capabilities, there's a bit of color coding, and IT strategic actions. So these are all just examples. I'd rather get to our interpretation of the framework. So don't feel like you need to take notes, have a look at these examples in detail on the screen, but it just shows you what the Gartner framework looks like. So if you want to take this further and self-complete, this is definitely then our recommendation. So at this point, as I get the IT strategy slides up for the Cyberlogic and ENS interpretation, I'm going to invite Andrea to say hello, introduce himself, and we're going to be having a bit of a panel discussion interview on the IT strategy components. I think also, Andrea, if you'd be so kind just to share a little bit about where Hyperclear Tech fits into the picture of our world and our family in the Hyperclear Tech, so to say, group companies. So thank you so much for being here and for supporting us in the webinar today.
Thank you, Francois, for the brief introduction. Yes, we'll cover that over the next few slides. Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrea. I'm the Group Chief Information Security Officer of Hyperclear Group, which is a holding company of 9 technology businesses, from IT managed services to cybersecurity, business process management, consulting, and a few startup platform businesses, as well as RPA. Now we're going to take a practical look at Gartner's IT strategy model and how it helps organizations, regardless of size or maturity, to achieve clarity, strategic alignment, and compliance with Africa's evolving regulatory landscape, particularly aligned with Joint Standard 1 and Joint Standard 2. Even if your organization already has a defined IT strategy, I'd argue that this model brings immense value to creating a shared language between board, IT compliance, and business teams. It forces us to connect strategy to execution and compliance to deliver value. Let's walk through the model together using 3 simple building blocks: business objectives, business capabilities, and IT strategic actions, and how it aligns to JS1 and JS2. And the first step in Gartner's model is business objectives. It is foundational and forms the why of the IT business strategy. Under JS1, your IT strategy must clearly align with the broader business strategy. This is not optional. It is responsibility of the board and executive leadership to ensure that alignment exists and is verifiable. In this model, business objectives might include goals like profitable growth, operational excellence, customer experience, or compliance excellence. And here's the benefit. This step helps IT leaders stay focused. Instead of building roadmaps based on technology trends, we build them based on real business needs. This is a powerful shift that improves board confidence, unlocks budget, and ensures traceability when the regulator comes knocking.
So in terms of this compliance exercise, we can almost reframe it as an innovation exercise, if it were, Andrea. How do you see that?
Correct. We use compliance to drive innovation, not slow it down. The clearer your business objectives are, the easier it is to prioritize secure, value-aligned IT investment from the board.
I think it aligns well with our quote from earlier, right, in that this can also empower you to be a change leader, and that compliance isn't this hurdle in terms of IT strategy, but it actually enables and empowers it. If we go to the second component on business capabilities, I'm wondering how you'd like to extend that further for us, Andrea.
So business capabilities, these are the things your organization must be able to do in order to meet those business objectives. Think of them as glue between strategy and action. Examples include expanding the reach of digital sales channels, creating accurate product recommendations, integrating all sources of customer data, or managing compliance to meet POPI or GDPR goals. In the language of JS1 and JS2, this is about defining what the IT function must enable securely and consistently. It also helps you decide whether capabilities need to be internally earned versus externally supported through vendors or partners.
In terms of like business capabilities, it's almost like it's becoming a framework for how to make good decisions. And that's not something we often see in IT strategy. One of the things we also talked about, Andrea, was many large organizations here might have an IT strategy, but it's not necessarily the case that it's actually applied or has evolved up to the reasonable or good standard. So I'm wondering, in terms of the framework for good decisions, how you feel about that. How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think the model helps define where potentially you've got gaps in your IT strategy. So, this step forms the what and forces you to make strategic decisions. What should IT build? What should we buy? And what must we govern, even if it is outsourced?
I think that really takes us into point 3 nicely. I did note a comment in the Q&A about outsourced IT service providers. So that's also something we'll be talking about as we go. So thank you for raising that. So that's definitely highlighted in our talk. On the IT strategic action side, now that we have that framework for good decision making, how does that evolve into good IT strategic actions?
So when we move into the IT strategic actions, the tangible high-level initiatives, projects, and changes required to build the business capabilities. Under JS1, your strategic actions must be formally documented, reviewed at least annually, and tracked for progress. Under JS2, many of these actions will be required by regulation. For example, implementing data classification tools, deploying SIEM and endpoint protection, automating warehouse operations with secure controls. The key takeaway here is that every strategic action must map clearly back to capability and an objective. This traceability is what makes your IT strategy defensible, auditable, and fundable.
I suppose we can go into far greater detail, right? The table is a snippet or a snapshot, but it is so nicely linked to the joint standard support, some of those examples that we do have on screen. I think what Vilmarie mentioned earlier is just how prescriptive this compliance framework is in terms of what one must do. So I certainly hope for those of you in the room, if you're looking for clarity, this is the sort of thing we're saying that your IT strategic plan needs to be able to demonstrate or be able to reflect. If we go to the summary slide, it really addresses all those 3 layers we've just been talking about. So how would you wrap up the IT strategy piece for us, Andrea, as we end this theme for the webinar?
The beauty of the Gartner model is in its simplicity. So it will identify where there's missing pieces or gaps, and it's understandable by everybody. So from IT to business to boards, and that's the beauty about it. It's not prescriptive about what tools to use or what technology to prioritize. Instead, it gives us a structured way to prove alignment with the business, build capabilities that matter, and act in ways that are traceable, defensible, and compliant. Whether you're refining an existing IT strategy or building one from scratch, this approach meets you where you are and takes you where JS1 and JS2 requires you to be.
Thank you very much, Andrea, again for helping us prepare from all the experience you have as a CIO in your own right, and for sharing a bit of that insight with the room today. It is much appreciated. I'll then go to the last slide on, we're calling this the IT Strategic Toolkit. When we look at the word toolkit, there's so many different types of toolkits out there. So we are framing this in the context of today's webinar, what we will be sharing with you. Any last final words of wisdom and insight, Andrea, from your side as we look at the key takeaways that we'll be sharing with the audience?
Sure. The biggest challenge is turning regulatory expectations into day-to-day operational artifacts. That's why we've developed a practical toolkit fully aligned with JS1 and JS2, bridges governance and business strategy. We use a one-pager to track every strategic action against business value and compliance impact, which supports both strategic planning and audit readiness. This also feeds directly into our SharePoint-based dashboards or Power BI and whatever tools you're using. Our policy matrix ensures we avoid duplication. Instead of managing popular JS1, JS2, and King 5 separately, we cross-map controls and review them quarterly as part of our compliance lifecycle. Integrated these artifacts with SharePoint, Power Automate, or other automation requirements. Any updates to a strategic action, policy, or risk trigger a notification and review task, and even auto-generate a board pack section. It's not about compliance for compliance sake. It's about delivering real business value with traceability, accountability, and agility. Use compliance to enable innovation. Board needs visibility into IT as well as business alignment. Automate what you can, status tracking, deviation, alerts, policy reviews, and use GRC platforms or SharePoint lists as your single source of truth.
That's so useful because I think there's a lot of items here that we can just do tomorrow, right? Without many layers of approval. So many organizations here use things like SharePoint, like lists. There are obvious opportunities for bits and pieces of automation. So I think that is already a useful view of what one can do. I think also, ladies and gentlemen, we are really looking at a toolkit self-empowerment approach, but of course, if you want to journey together further, the advice becomes more bespoke, more tailored from here. But we certainly hope that from an overall perspective, this is useful to you thus far. So thank you again, Andrea, for supporting us with this piece. I'm going to go over to the next section. Thanks, Andrea. I'm going to go over to the next section shortly. There's a very good question that has popped up in the Q&A, and I'll rely on Vilmarie to help answer that with us as we go further from here. But just to give the room an idea of what question has popped up, there's a view on whether this is overly prescriptive or whether there should be a more principle-based approach to the regulation. So we'll definitely, I think, answer that as we go from here, because we're starting to talk about IT risk management. So please just keep that question open in the poll, or in the Q&A rather, and let's see if we can answer that in the coming section. All right. So we're at the IT risk management framework side now that we've talked about IT strategy. And we're going to follow the same approach now as we've introduced to you before. So this area in particular is involved in setting up a system to identify, assess, and manage risks related to IT within the organization. And I think that the language is fairly straightforward and makes a lot of sense. So I'm not necessarily going to pause on this too much, but rather get into the practicalities, considering the time we have left with us in the session. So at this point, I'm going to start inviting my colleague Genevieve to contribute towards the conversation, to introduce herself to you as well, and to say hello. And taking us into this next theme of what IT risk management looks like if we were building or renovating a home. So Genevieve, hello, thank you also for being here. Always nice to see you. Would you be so kind to contribute to the conversation from here onwards?
Sure. Thanks, Roger. Good morning, everyone. Just a little bit of background about me. I'm in the cybersecurity team, the GRC team within CyberLogic. My background is in business and IT process improvement, internal and external audit, and all things related to governance, risk, and compliance. So in terms of the house analogy, think about your IT risk management framework as a foundation of the house. So a strong foundation is planned and built carefully, checked regularly, and make sure that you can handle bad weather or unexpected events or disasters. So in the same way, IT risk should be constantly reviewed for new threats and include solid plans and strategies to avoid or mitigate any IT risks based on your tolerance. So if you've got a tolerance to accept the risk or not. So with a solid foundation, organizations can stay safe, resilient, and handle any surprises. So
thank you.
Sorry, Francois.
Okay, hey Genevieve.
Sorry, Francois, can you repeat yourself?
Feel like I may have interrupted you by accident there. Did you want to share anything further on the risk management framework and how it speaks to our narrative today?
Yes, so basically, yeah, it's the foundation of, the risk management. So the analogy is you would need a solid foundation to experience and weather the storms and IT risk frameworks and, anticipate the threats and the risks when performing these regular risk assessments. And speaking about the foundation, you would also consider privacy by design. So essentially, privacy by design is a proactive approach that embeds security and privacy at the very beginning and when designing your systems, your IT processes, your networks, your services, or your products. So you need to consider that in the initial design phase. When you basically securing your application design architecture, your risk assessments, your privacy impact assessments to ensure that there are robust security measures like encryption, access controls, data minimization as considered as part of your foundation and it's not as an afterthought. Thanks, Francois. I'm going to hand over to Wilmarie to take us through the LPPT table.
If we go back into our table, it's certainly interesting to see in the process column how much language is just covered in there and the different, I suppose, specifics, right? So I'm curious to hear about the specifics that the legislation is putting forward. Also, what's interesting for me is the growing bullet pointed list here to the left-hand side from the legal perspective and the various bits of legislation. So I'm also keen to hear from you on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Francois. So in terms of when we look at IT risk management, and this part is quite prescriptive in the joint standard. We've tried to really summarize it short here, but it is a few pages long. So there's a lot of detail in terms of what must be included and what not. So when we start at legal, again, as we followed the same approach as before, we're looking at what is the requirement under Joint Standard 1, but then also what other pieces of legislation also talks about or would impact on your IT risk management. So for instance, POPI, Condition 7, when we talk about security safeguards and your operators, so agreements and that needs to be in place with your IT service providers or your operators with whom you share data. We spoke about the King Code. So again, when we look at IT risk management, there's an obligation on the board to ensure that there are proper governance structures in place to mitigate IT risk. That is contained in our King Codes. Joint Standard 2, which we deal on day 3. So again, the security aspect, as we said, goes on the side of all our little bubbles because it's overarching. But then also, if we look at previous directives by the prudent authority, or even in the joint standards, 1 of 24 that talks about insurers and outsourcing, the same with the banks outsourcing and banks cloud computing. All of these talks about measures that must be put in place when we deal with IT assets or IT outsourcing or IT contracting. And so that is why under legal, we've listed all of the pieces of legislation that also talks about or have requirements in terms of our IT risk management. What do we have to put in place to ensure that we have a proper IT risk management framework? So in terms of the process, the joint standards require you to develop an IT risk management framework. Now, this can form part of your enterprise-wide risk management framework, but there has to be some documented specific IT risk management framework. Again, it has to be approved by your board and it has to be reviewed annually. So what must be included in this IT risk management framework? Like we said before, the joint standards are quite prescriptive, but to summarize it, it says that there must be documented policies, standards, and procedures in place. There must be a risk register, so a specific register where you can list the various risks, and there's a method for your people to actually report risk, and there's a register that monitors and report risk and look at risk mitigation. So you must have a risk mitigation plan, and that must be documented. Interesting, it says that your policies and procedures must be independently reviewed. The joint standards also ask you to have very specific roles and responsibilities allocated to manage IT risk. Again, it reiterates that the board must oversee these roles and responsibilities and that the board is fully responsible. And I think this is important. It's a theme we see throughout the joint standard, that they emphasize the responsibility, we can call it liability of the board when it comes to IT risk management. There must be specific function or department responsible for risk management. And Francois, I think this is also where the question will come in, but what if we outsource? We can speak about this a little bit more, and you can add to that as well. But I think, and we had these questions again when we dealt with the whole compliance process under POPI and data privacy. I think there would be an understanding that smaller organizations may outsource some of these IT functions, and I don't think there's anything in the joint standards that says you're not allowed to outsource, as long as you still have these frameworks in place, whether it is your risk management, and part of that can be outsourcing, and then we will look back at what is the requirements when we outsource. So we'll look at what is the kind of contractual terms that have to be in place when we outsource. But even if we do outsource, our board will still have to oversee and still remain fully responsible. So I suppose then it is, are you selecting your IT outsource providers properly? And when we look at specifically when they talk about people management in IT risk management, there's a specific section dealing with your screening of your staff, but not only staff, also your vendors where you outsource. So it specifically states that you have to not only screen them, but also make sure that they are fit and proper. So are they properly qualified? And have a contractual agreement with them that they will adhere to protect certain sensitive and confidential information. So when this section actually specifically deals with people management and places an obligation on organizations to ensure that where they outsource or where they and it's not just the IT function, but also where they contract with IT service providers or employ and staff into the IT roles, that there are proper vetting and call it audits in place to ensure that your service providers or your staff that deal with IT risk and management are properly vetted, have the proper technical know-how, and that there's proper contractual relationships in place. The requirements also require that there must be a process to control and manage risk, and that interesting, it's quite prescriptive in saying you must consider insurance cover. Now, it doesn't say you must get insurance cover, but it does say that you must consider it, which I thought was quite interesting. Then also identification and classification of IT assets and associated risk and vulnerability. So we will see this as we go on to the next IT operations as well. But it is requiring organizations to have a list of critical IT assets and what is the potential vulnerabilities and risks that may impact that, and what happens if that IT asset are impacted. So whether it is a cyber attack, so anything that what is the risk associated with that, and what is the impact, and what is our plan to monitor and deal with that risk. So it is quite prescriptive again in terms of how you need to classify and list your IT assets and certain vulnerabilities around that. So if we then look at our to-do list, so the first thing is either to develop, or then if you already have, to review your IT risk management framework to ensure that you obtain board approval and to ensure that you review that annually. In terms of our compliance tracker, so what is the things that we think you have to put in place? An IT asset register. So we've seen that the joint standards put quite a bit of detail around of how you need to prioritize your critical assets and have a list of IT assets and their criticality, their vulnerabilities, and the risk associated with that. You have to compile a risk register. Your risk register is to facilitate the monitoring and reporting of risk. You have to develop a risk mitigation plan. You have to conduct risk impact assessments. You have to review your risk assessments and your risk registers annually. Role allocation with board oversight. We've spoke about the various role allocations. Then looking at your procurement process. So doing a review of your current procurement process for IT service providers. And what we've done before is we've created checklists for IT procurement. We specifically did this with the prudent authorities outsourcing for banks, and the same kind of process will have to be applied here now. So where we are appointing IT service providers, there are certain requirements, certain checks we have to do to ensure that our IT service providers, and specifically for critical IT assets, are properly screened. And the same then review our HR process when we appoint people in sensitive IT roles, security roles, data privacy roles. What is the screening process, and are our processes currently sufficient? Then important, as we saw, that our policies has to be documented So not just processes that's all over the place, but we have to actually document it. It's doing a gap analysis of what policies and procedures do we currently have in place. Is that sufficient? Do we need to supplement with new policies and procedures? So reviewing your existing policies and procedures and adding new policies and procedures, or reviewing existing policies and procedures where that is necessary. And then obviously training staff. Trying to, sorry, Francois, move just our slide. So that is kind of our overview of the IT risk management in terms of a summary of the joint standard. Francois, we just looked at the IT strategy, but now we see we also need an IT risk management framework. It would be nice if you could give us some examples of how does that IT risk management framework practically look?
Sure, Vilmarie. And you know what's happened as you were sharing with us a lot of the requirements. There's a great question that came up in the Q&A, and I'm hoping we can answer it live quickly because I think it will help us as we move further. There is an attendee who mentioned that we already have a comprehensive enterprise management framework, and the question from a legal perspective, I feel it's relevant for you. Does the joint standard require us to have a standalone IT risk management framework to be compliant with the joint standard? I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I don't think it doesn't have to be standalone. So we'll see that the joint standards specifically say that your IT risk management framework can be integrated with your enterprise risk management framework. So part of your overall business framework. And in fact, it says that it has to be aligned with your business framework. I think what is important is just that you ensure where you have an overall risk management framework, that the components of the joint standard 2 is contained in that. In other words, what I'm saying is review that existing policy, which can, and I suppose you will have a section in there that deals specifically with IT risk management, but just make sure that where you have that overall governance framework or risk management framework, that those items that's listed in the joint standard. So if you look at what must be in your risk management framework, it is important that your policy then can tick all of those requirements that is set out in the joint standard. So it doesn't have to be a standalone policy. It can be part of your overall risk management policy, but it has to comply with the requirements of the joint standard, if that makes sense.
I have marked that Q&A response as answered live, so I certainly hope that did address the question, and it was a great question. So thank you. Keep them coming, please, into the Q&A. As Vilmarie mentioned before, so what does this look like practically? Now, you may feel a little bit overwhelmed because you already have a risk management framework, and maybe there's different ways of interpreting it. So at this point, I'm going to also just recommend my colleague Genevieve to contribute further into the conversation here. So there's also what the joint standards require, Genevieve, but then there are, I think, can I call them even popular risk management frameworks, or frameworks that some of these organizations in the room today have to comply with? Can one lean into that? Can we work with what we have and build on it if we're already working towards frameworks that we have on the screen here today?
Yes, Francois, that's correct. So these are the widely used risk management frameworks. It's readily available, well, not the ISO so much, but like the NIST RMF, it's readily available on their website. It provides you with a step-by-step process from preparing, categorizing, to selecting and implementing controls, to the monitoring of the risks. So you could use this framework and incorporate it into your existing one if there are any gaps in your framework. But then there's also other risk management frameworks like the ISO 27001. They also heavily in terms of risk management, where they've got a plan, do, act model, and it's basically on your planning your information security around risks. And aligning those security measures with your business objectives, and also meeting with the standards and the regulatory frameworks that or requirements that you need to comply with. So you can integrate these once if it's not already integrated, but it's usually a standard approach that they have, and it's usually just to prepare, create your risk register, identify the threats, your vulnerabilities, assess those risks in terms of impact and likelihood, and then develop, if there's any mitigating controls or if there's things that you need to implement. But yeah, it follows basically a standard approach. There's some variances or differences, but yeah, you can have a look at those frameworks to see what would be best suited for your organization.
Thanks, Genevieve. And I think we're going to also go into a bit of the system practicality approach shortly. But I jokingly always say behind every great business, there is a spreadsheet somewhere. So I don't think we're advising.
Francois, I don't know if it's just me, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, I also can't hear.
Give me a second to see
You're back.
That sounds better.
sound. Thank you so much. So I like to joke and say behind every great business there's a spreadsheet somewhere. So I think the next slide will contain a spreadsheet view, but it's not necessarily our recommendation, but it just outlines a nice example of what one would look at and then use as criteria for a risk management tool, if I'm correct, Jen. So if you can just elaborate a bit on what we're seeing on the screen here.
Yes, so there's various examples of how you manage your risk. You can use technology or systems, or you could use what you already have, Excel spreadsheets. And ideally, maybe one Excel spreadsheet or one document would be ideal. But it doesn't have to be a system. It can be a spreadsheet where you can document your risk register and all the risks applicable to your business. It doesn't just have to be IT or cybersecurity related. It could be business related as well. In one document where you can list all your risks, you can identify all the vulnerabilities, the threats, assess those risks against the likelihood and impact according to your risk management methodology, and score those. And then identify any current mitigation controls that are in place, or if you need to put any controls in place to reduce or mitigate the risk. And that can all be in one spreadsheet if you'd like. Francois, if you can go into the next screen. Then there's also some examples of tools that's in the market already. So there's OneTrust that's on the screen at the moment. You can use that to manage your risk, and it provides reporting and dashboards for board level committees where you would like to see, how it looks practically in terms of like, this is, the highest risk. Should we rather focus on these risks for now? And it provides a centralized collection of risk information and streamlines risk assessments through automated workflows. And yeah, like I mentioned, it provides board level reporting. Yeah, and also the next screen, it will also show there's another example of a system called Central Eyes, where you could also see, and this is specifically for cybersecurity, but it also gives you a good visual in terms of like, these are the risks that's in the organization, what's the likelihood and impact, and where should we focus our attention on for that. Thanks, Francois.
Thank you, Jen. I think it's good for the room just to note that we are not necessarily resellers of these platforms. We're famously technology neutral and impartial. So depending on what the need is, we'll put forward what we think the best, tools are. And I think many of you here would be using some of these already. So I certainly hope that you're feeling a little bit more encouraged that if you are using the tool, that, okay, cool, we can use it, we can augment it with the templates or frameworks. I see an open note in the chat from Precious. Yes, we will definitely be sharing as many of the templates as we can from the webinar, and we'll make that available to you. I think before one jumps into a system or a platform, it's very important to have your criteria set, and that's something that Jen also referred to earlier, is that you need to know exactly what it is that you want and need. So their IT stakeholders can be quite good to help define what that criteria is. One of the other comments I got in the week as we were preparing is we don't just want to show the room, well, what it is that you need to comply with, but if we have existing things or tools in our organization, can we use it? And I certainly hope you feel like that's the case. If we go to the next section, and this will be our final section for this morning. I see we're doing well for time still. We're at about 10:30. So thank you for being here with us. We certainly hope that you're finding this useful, valuable, and insightful so far. And I'm going to go into our IT operations piece. Probably the one that I can talk about the most. If I had the day, I would have been able to do a whole talk just on this. But we're going to summarize and streamline the topic as best we can. From an IT operations perspective, there's a few bits and pieces to highlight here in what is being shared with us. It focuses on things like day-to-day activities, maintaining IT infrastructure, handling changes and incidents, and ensuring that IT services are delivered effectively and efficiently. These are umbrella terms, if I can call them that, because each of these would be different processes, different elements of a well-functioning IT environment. And again, to the earlier point that Wilmarie is making, the joint standards is quite prescriptive. So it's very clear in terms of what we need to comply with and focus on. So in terms of the IT operations side, I'm hoping that we have a good further narrative here in terms of looking at our house, looking at the renovation and building of a house. You need routines for cleaning, fixing leaks, and keeping an inventory of appliances. And similarly, IT operations need structured and documented procedures. And we'll be expanding on those a little bit now as we move forward. What I want to do is actually just go back to our poll from earlier. And it's very interesting for me to see just how it has evolved since the initial contributions were made towards it. We've got about 10 people overall, and there's a very high need, especially on the response that I asked, understanding how IT and other non-legal aspects are impacted by this legislation. This is certainly a section that would speak to that very clearly. Now, if we go to the LPPT approach again and visit our table, I want to invite Wilmarie to help us frame it as best possible. Again, just prioritizing the legal foundations we have in the LPPT table. Interesting for me, Wilmarie, as I invite you to help us with this particular table, there's a note there on cloud computing and offshoring of data, which I also thought was very interesting. That was noticed, as well as one of the directives on outsourcing. So if you'd be so kind just to set the foundation here, I'd appreciate it to take that forward into the practicality.
Thanks, Francois. So again, at this very much the same legal requirements as we've seen under IT risk management. And so again, when we look at our IT operations, we always look at our IT service providers as well, because they're a critical part of managing our IT operations and also the risk and security around that. And so that's why we mentioned the outsourcing directives as well. In terms of process for IT operations, so when we look at the requirement and the joint standard for IT operations, we're looking at, like Francois just said, our day-to-day maintenance and management of our IT functions and IT operations. So the joint standards requires you to develop a robust set of IT service management framework. In what must this include? So again, there's quite a bit of detail around what must be in your IT management framework, but it is things like change management. How do we deal with change, and what is our change management process? How do we deal with software maintenance and release? How often do we review our software? And what is our process for software release management? How do we deal with incident management? And again, here, that touches on things like data breaches, POPI. How do we deal with an incident? What is the process and procedures? What is our, and these we often find very useful to have decision trees, which we've created for incident management, for security breaches under POPI as well. But to have that documented and have a process where we can say, this is how we respond to incidences. It requires you to have, again, well-documented policies. And this is, Francois, we've seen this theme over and over, that the joint standards require us to have well-documented policies in place. It requires you to have a register of critical IT operations, and up-to-date IT asset inventory. So under IT risk framework just now, the previous slide, we looked in detail, and that requirement have quite a bit of detail around your IT risk register. So I think it is kind of repeating it here, but it's also adding to it in saying you also have to have a register of critical IT operations. So we have our list of these are all our IT assets, and we have them classified and prioritized, and what is sensitive and what is critical. But also in terms of our IT operations, what is our register of critical IT operations? Logging and monitoring procedure for critical IT operations has to be in place. And then it gets quite prescriptive in terms of saying things like you have to store your IT configurations. You have to implement performance capacity planning, monitoring to prevent and detect performance issues. So how do we deal with all of that? Define your IT backup and restoration procedures, test that annually. I'm just going to move on to the next slide and then come back just so that we can go through the list. IT change management process has to be recorded. Your problem incident management process has to be recorded. And then again, implement segregation between duties. So between your development team, your testing team, and your operations team. So this section deals quite a bit with system development, software development as well, and then having that segregation between duties, between your team that is developing, your team that is testing, and your operations team. So again, quite a mouthful and quite descriptive in terms of how we need to have certain policies and procedures documented and listed and registered and assets lists available. So in terms of our to-do list then, it is to make sure we have developed, or then if you already have something like this, review your IT service management framework, which will, like we say, deal with things like change management, software release, incident management. Have a register of your critical IT operations, create a logging system for critical IT operations, store your IT configurations, implement performance capacity planning, define backup and restoration procedures, and this must be tested annually. I'm going through this quite fast because things like your IT backup restoration, these kind of things will be dealt with in a lot more detail under Joint Standard 2 on day 3, when we look at, and I think even tomorrow we touch on backups and resilience, but this will be dealt with in more detail in the coming days. Like I said, define your IT management, change management process and incident management process. Again, gap analysis quite important here in order to compare what you already have in place. A lot of these things are not new. It is not something that we've never heard of. A lot of these things will be in place already in your organizations. I think the question is just, is it in place to the detail that is required in the joint standard? And is it properly documented? A lot of times we have processes and procedures in place, but it is not properly documented. So ensuring that we have documented and identified all of these processes and procedures, and making sure we have all the relevant policies in place we need to have in place. Again, reviewing our agreements and contracts with our IT suppliers to ensure that we have the proper provisions in place where we talk about service levels. So do we have robust service levels in our IT service agreements? Do we have business continuity and disaster recovery dealt with? Do we have termination assistance? How do we deal with change management? How do we deal with our software updates? So again, just reviewing our existing agreements with our IT suppliers to ensure that those agreements adhere to the principles of Joint Standards 2. Francois, in a nutshell, that was our overview of IT operations. Like you say, we can talk about this probably for a whole day because there's quite a bit of detail around managing our IT operations. But in terms of our LPPT process, and again, just to reiterate, this will definitely differ from organization to organization, but hopefully it's given you an overview or just something to start this process with.
Thank you, Vilmarie. You know, as you were sharing with us, there's also an interesting question that came into the Q&A that I hope we can also answer live if you're comfortable. There's a question around to what extent data and AI risks are covered or mentioned in the frameworks. And I think that was quite an interesting question from a legal perspective. Do you feel comfortable speaking to it live?
Sure, and I think so specifically data, there's a section dealing on and I think that is our first topic tomorrow. Yes, handling of sensitive data and confidential data. So we're going to deal in a lot of detail with data tomorrow, and data is a critical part of all of these policies and framework. I don't think any company can operate without data, and data risk is probably one of the biggest risks for organizations today. And we see it because we assist often with data breaches, and it is it's massive at the moment in terms of the amount of data security issues that we certainly, and I know your team would deal with it as much. So we definitely know that data is critical and very much part of all of these frameworks. AI, we also mentioned that I think in a bit more detail tomorrow, but AI is definitely also covered. I don't think going forward, any responsible risk management plan will not have AI in it. When we look at emerging technologies, AI is definitely a very big one. Francois, as you know, we have been training organizations on the responsible and safe use of AI. And what we always say is there's no way we're going to stop our staff and people and organizations from using AI. It's becoming such an integral part of how we work, of how we do business. But there are risks involved as much as there are benefits. And we always like to highlight there's lots of benefits in using AI, but definitely, and I think where we list recommendations for policies, we did say AI policy is critical because using AI is going to become such a big part of our organizations. Poppy deals with automated decision making, which is a core part of AI. But yes, knowing knowing how our business is using AI and giving guidelines on what is allowed, how can you use AI, how do we protect our IP, our confidential information from, like we've had instances where staff would import marketing information or critical business information into AI, and AI come up with certain outputs, but it is making sure that we don't put company confidential information into generative AI. So how do I deal with that confidentiality issues, but how do I also deal with IP, where I use AI to create certain IP that then becomes a big part of my brand? Are we sure who's got ownership over that? So there's tons of issues with AI that definitely forms very much part of this. We have a AI seminar in May again. So for those of you that is interested in that, where we deal with the question of AI and the risk and how do we deal with that in a lot more detail. It is such a big topic that we touch on it here, but because there's so much that we already have to deal with in here, we don't go into it in detail. But I think the short answer is yes, definitely. Data and AI is a very big part of all of these policies and frameworks.
So as Vilmarie mentioned, please do continue the journey with us over the next couple of days as we do speak about handling of sensitive information in tomorrow's agenda. Thank you very much for that question. I'm also going to address the question that came up earlier today, and I think that was in the open chat from Lisa. So in terms of going forward with the IT operations side, I'm going to split my facilitation in two, so to say. So if you're a smaller organization, I do believe that it makes more sense to outsource your IT operation if it's not part of your design to have that in-sourced. And that's an exercise I often do with clients, like what tech talent do you buy, lease, or invest into? And that's a conversation we can have, broadly speaking. But if you've landed on the outsourcing side, I think it's very important to be able to hold your IT service provider accountable to a lot of the best practices and what we're seeing on here. So this is really useful for you to be able to go back into. As somebody who works for a leading MSP, it's something we've put together in the, I'm just going to go to the second slide for my example. You'll see there's change management process. We did a lovely guide the other day for a client, which we called the Change and Support Guide. And it empowered everybody in the organization to know what is the trigger for a change, how is the change request logged, what sort of an online form is completed, how long will it take, who reviews it. All those are best practices you would expect from your IT service provider or outsourced IT partner. And I think it's hopefully going to help you, this LPPT framework, to be able to pose those questions and to ensure that it is covered in the design of your outsourced IT scope and service parameters. And that's certainly something that I hope helps answer that question. So do stay with us as well, as it will help you in the coming days to ask the right questions to your outsourced IT party and many of you may have relationships with outsourced providers over the years. If you're a big organization and you're not outsourcing everything, but certain bits and pieces, it's equally as relevant. You may have an independent party coming in to do a pen test, for example. This is also relevant for you. So do keep that in mind. Unfortunately, because this is a webinar, I can't go into specifics of client environments or scenarios. But if you are a large organization, I think the service management platforms that you use will be quite valuable just to touch on quickly. So I'm using a Gartner Voice of the Customer framework here for us today, and you'll see there's a few familiar names potentially if you're an IT stakeholder attending. Gartner has ranked where they are roughly in the market, and I'm going to segment them a bit further to make it relevant to us in the financial services space. So if I go further, maybe you recognize some of these. You'll see we, skipped ahead a bit. There's a segmentation per region. So it's very interesting for me to see Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, what they prefer and what the Gartner peer community rated as good IT service management platforms. But then going one step further, I've also had a look at what are the more popular platforms these days in the financial services sector or industry. So ServiceNow came up quite a lot. SysAid also came up frequently. So I'm hoping some of the platforms are certainly familiar to you. And you may be asking me like, Francois, I can't go and implement a new platform now to manage my IT day to day. We're a large organization. That's certainly not going to be quick. So one of the positives from today is there is certainly a way to update your platform for joint standard compliance support and enablement. Now, I'm just using ServiceNow as an example. I'm not saying this is my overall recommendations. I think that's important just to note. If you look at ServiceNow, all of these ITSM platforms have modules. So you've got the module here in the middle, and we've got the compliance enabling element or different pieces of what we discussed today, and some of the notes that I made here in terms of what can work. So there's definitely a way to, if we look at the building and the house narrative, there's definitely a way to go and, can I say, retrofit or renovate your choice of management platform to take the compliance effort further from a joint standard perspective. That will require a bit of gap analysis work, if I'll be honest with you, and a little bit of attention. So depending on what you decide to do, I certainly recommend that you and your IT stakeholders have a look. I'm just going to go back to our table. Have a look at the table and have a look at your current platform, do a little bit of a gap analysis and see what you can use off the bat already. It's currently in there to enable your compliance effort. Of course, that's something we can help you with as well as we consider any journey forward with you. So that is my piece on the IT service management and IT operations side of our talk today. I'm going to just leave 10 quick minutes towards the end of our session to invite Vilmarie to share any last thoughts. We will also be responding to the Q&A now in the Zoom Q&A section. So I'll be doing that shortly, but Vilmarie, as we end day one, do you have any final views for us and also, I suppose, motivation to continue the journey into day 2 and 3?
Yeah, thank you, Francois. I think definitely now that you have a sense of how we approach this in the LPP table, day 2 and 3 is just going to be building on this. So we're going to go through, tomorrow we're starting off with handing of sensitive and confidential information. And so obviously, like I said earlier, that is a big section for us because it's not only the joint standards, it is a whole lot of, it's poppy, it is very encompassing, but also some very other interesting topics that we're going to continue to work through and try and break down into our LPPT approach. So from my side, I hope that today and the approach we've taken in breaking it down into the table and giving you some practical examples have been helpful. But yeah, we look forward to getting your feedback on that approach. Francois, I thought I've answered it in the Q&A, but maybe just to touch on it here, because it's a question we actually get quite a lot in terms of group compliance. And it was something we dealt with quite a bit in detail with data privacy compliance journey as well. Where you're part of a big group, every entity in that group has to have its own policies and how do we deal with group compliance. And I think the simple question there is where you have separate legal entities, every legal entity has its own board, as its own, and then there might be in your group overlap, but it's got its own compliance obligation or its own liability. And so while obviously groups often have an overarching group policy and group policies that's filtered down to its subsidiaries, where you have very different businesses in that group. So for example, in this question where in the same group there might be an FSP and an insurer, the policies and procedures that apply to those various businesses may overarchingly be the same, but there will have to be some specifics that only apply to an FSP or only apply to the insurer. Like for instance, the insurer has to comply with Joint Standard 1 of 2024 for insurance outsourcing, which the FSP may not have to comply with. So while it is obviously good to have a group structure of policies, because it becomes very complex if every entity in the group is doing its own thing. So we're all for conformity, but again, there may not be a one-size-fits-all approach. It may have to be that this is the group policy, but we adapt it for our various business units to also ensure we cater for that business unit specific risk relating to its product. And one of the topics tomorrow is the risk associated with certain FSP products. So I think it is important to understand that various divisions or business in our group may have different risk profiles or may have different need to apply things a little bit differently. So again, in short, group policies are great, but blindly adapting it for every entity in that group a bit risky. So making sure that your group policy actually fits for purpose in that specific division, and whether that is by then adopting that policy but having a separate little schedule where you make it more specific, or you address items in either the joint standards or other legislation that's more specific to your business. That is what we would suggest in that.
Thank you very much again for that question that came into the chat. I think the questions that we're receiving have been fantastic. I'm also getting a thank you for the LPPT table. We are delighted to hear that. So thank you also for sharing that you feel the framework is valuable. So I think at this point, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to conclude day 1's session. The frameworks, the templates will be made available to you. We'll coordinate that separately. And also, if you have any questions, please don't be afraid to reach out to us. We will consider that as we go throughout the next day or two. So from my side and everybody on the panel, thank you for trusting us with your time and with this significant requirement for your organization to chat through it with you. It's an absolute pleasure. And once again to ENS for also trusting me to be your host for the event. Really appreciate it as well. And we'll see you tomorrow. At this point, we can also stop the recording.
Sorry, Francois. Sorry to
Yes.
interject. I do see that
Yes,
there is a
Roscoe.
question outstanding that we didn't answer from Timbani. I would like to answer that one just so that we can close out all the questions from today, if you don't mind.
Yes, certainly. Apologies. I thought we would be typing the response, but delighted to hear we'll be responding live. So thank you.
So sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so the question is really asking, if the joint standards aren't stepping back into a more, backwards approach to rules-based and not really giving the grant to organizations to tackle it, as it is needed based on the unique risk profiles. And I think the answer to that from my side is it's not too much of a step backward. I do understand where the question is coming from. But as you can see within the standards itself, they do use words like appropriate and relevant. So it does give that room to apply where needed based on the organization situation. However, it has become a lot more controls mandated because specifically in the IT technology space and cybersecurity space, there is kind of little room for gray area when it comes to IT risk. There are different controls which are specifically implemented to tackle specific risks, which 99% of organizations would face if they have an IT environment. So that is why it does tend to lean more on you need to have these controls or these aspects in place in your organization. Yeah.
Thank you, Roscoe. I hope and trust that was also a good response to the question that was raised in the chats. Timbani, thank you for that as well. So currently on my side, I see all the Q&A has been addressed. Vilmarie is also just mentioning in the chat that the recording will be available, but if you want to maximize those CPD points, you have to just consider being present. So we're looking forward to seeing you in the next couple of days. Okay, right. So from my side, I'll then close off the webinar. Looking forward to seeing you. Thank you again, and see you same time, same place tomorrow.